Hi everyone, welcome to Survivor Stories with the Human Collaborative. I want to first acknowledge that we are on unceded Nisqually territory of the Coast Salish peoples. I am Eric Gray. I use they or he pronouns, and I am happy to be here today to facilitate an amazing conversation about survivor stories and survivor perspectives in regards to the commercial sex trades and commercial sexual exploitation. We have some really amazing panelists on today, one of which is sitting next to me, Jerry Muma.
Hi, and my name is Jerry Muma, and I am incredibly honored to be a part of Survivor Stories and this collaboration. I serve as the Executive Director for Innovation's Human Trafficking Collaborative, and we are really all about collaborating together and elevating the voices of survivors. So thank you for having me.
We also have Francesca.
Hi. Hello. This is Francesca Awambulidi. I'm a survivor of sex and labor trafficking, and I'm the founding director of a survivors, specifically female-led survivors of human trafficking organization called Survivors Network. We are based in Cameroon, and one of our main aim is to see that survivors come together as a one strong big voice to make their voices heard and people to know that they need to come to their plight. And we are so happy, and I'm so happy to represent survivors all over Cameroon and Africa in this panel. It's a great honor to me. Once more, it's a privilege. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're really lucky to have you. And we have Kira here as well. Hi, Kira.
Hi, my name is Kira Dovek, and I'm the Executive Director for Washington Trafficking Prevention. I'm also a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation here in Washington State, also known as domestic sex trafficking. And I'm really honored to be here and be a part of this conversation, and I look forward to connecting with all of you and sharing some really great information.
Thanks, Kira. Really thankful for everyone's participation today. My hope is that the people in power and with decision-making power will be able to hear what we have to say and will listen to survivors. So we're gonna start off with Jerry and I just having a conversation real quick about what some of our perspectives that we see from Innovations HTC. Innovations HTC is where I am a programs director at. I'm also with the City of Seattle Human Rights Commission and co-founder of the Human Collaborative. And we're gonna come from a lot of different perspectives today. Try to give it a succinct viewpoint on commercial sexual exploitation in Washington State, King County, and Seattle. Innovations HTC is a 501c3 out of it's a nonprofit out of Olympia, Washington. We're an Indigenous and survivor-led agency. Hey. And our goal is to foster unity and collaboration to end human trafficking.
You know, when we really think about human trafficking, a lot of times people think, oh, this is just something that happens in, foreign countries, and, it's stereotypical, kind of like a HBO special, people coming over in shipping containers, chained to walls and so forth. But, I don't want to dismiss that does happen, but here in the United States, what we see is a large amount of domestic trafficking, which means our own brothers and sisters, aunties, uncles, neighbors are being exploited. What you see here on the map is the Polaris National Trafficking Hotline, and this heat sink map represents calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And these calls can be from a community member where somebody saw something and reported it. It could be a survivor reaching out for resources, law enforcement reporting. I do know that when we as a direct service organization, have cases that I do reach out, because it's really important that these are documented, because if human trafficking goes unreported, people think that it's not happening. One of the things that I want to point out on this map is that any place that is red is considered a high density area of calls. And we are here on the West Coast in Washington State. And so if you look at the upper left hand, it is flaming red all the way down the East Coast. And it's also very high density throughout the central United States and the East Coast. And human trafficking is an equal opportunity destroyer. And it doesn't care if you come from rural or urban communities, or what your socioeconomic level is, what your gender identity is. It does not discriminate. And so when we're looking for cases and looking for human trafficking, you just really need to be very open-minded and really recognize and respond and report.
I want to talk a little bit too about journey through identity, journey through life experience. You know, I first came to an understanding that I was a victim of trafficking and a survivor of trafficking and a survivor support group as a case manager, actually. I was dropping off a client who would ask for some more community, some specific supports around her trafficking experience. And I was invited in to sit with this group. I didn't know that they had researched me. I actually had a college presentation about my involvement in the sex trade. And I didn't know it was still on Prezi. And so they had invited me in. I'm really grateful actually that that was still on Prezi, because I would have never had this conceptualization without it. And I seen my sister talking about her experience at the head of this group. And she gave me a gift of understanding that the things that had happened to me were my fault. And I didn't understand prior to that moment. And I didn't have the privilege to understand prior to that moment, because I've been surviving for so long, that someone had taken advantage of me, that human trafficking is a crime that exploits vulnerabilities. And actually many people had exploited those vulnerabilities. And people bought and sold me for drugs, for alcohol, for money, for places to stay, for safety. I didn't understand that that wasn't my fault. And it wasn't a consensual act. It wasn't a consensual transaction between two adults. A, I started when I was a child. And B, even as an adult, I had no other options. And I think for me as an Indigenous person, when I look about how human trafficking and the commercial sex trade has affected my people, there was no such thing as prostitution or trafficking prior to first Western contact. And I actually cannot consent as an Indigenous person to the continued settling of my body and my people. I don't consent to that further colonization. So I think when we talk about our journey, there's so many different ways to think about it, right?
There is, you know, and when we're looking at conceptualizing what commercial sexual exploitation or trafficking is, a lot of people don't understand that. And actually, before the year 2000, when the Trafficking Victim Protection Act came out, which was the first federal legislation, I know for myself, I'm a survivor of trafficking. I am an Indigenous woman. I am Shoshone, Bannock, and Cree. And the first time that I read what the Trafficking Victim Protection Act was, it's, you know, anybody under the age of 18 is automatically considered a victim. Age alone is enough mitigating factor. Really, if there's force, fraud, or coercion, in my case, there definitely was force, fraud, or coercion, and I was also a child. And one of the things that I think is really important is that this disproportionately affects people of color and minority communities. And this is facing a culture shock And, you know, when we're looking, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it, you know, predominantly it is Black and brown people being exploited for sex, and buyers are predominantly middle to upper class white people. And so I can tell you, I want to elaborate a little bit on what my brother Eric said. You know, prior to colonization, prior to people coming and stealing indigenous land, none of our languages, you cannot find any history that has prostitution, exploitation, anything like that. But what happened is, on first contact is when it started. A lot of people don't know that Christopher Columbus was a sex trafficker and a labor trafficker. If you go back, and it is fact-checked and available to look online, some of his journal entries saying that he could get more in trade for a 9 or 10-year-old indigenous person than they could trading horses. And that's what the market was. You know, so when we're really looking at our journeys, it's about understanding and conceptualizing what happened to us, and being able to find that support, and being able to build community and move forward in your healing journey.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Really when we look at some of the ways we've been impacted and things that are helpful, you know, I know for me, culture has been incredibly helpful in grounding me. But to kind of follow up on some of the things that Jerry had mentioned, you know, when colonization has removed our culture, has created polarizations within culture, lateral oppression within access to culture, and really removed a lot of indigenous knowledge and the ways of maneuvering that, I don't have full access to culture. Culture cannot do for me what my ancestors intended for it to do. And that's directly at the hand of white colonizers. And I think we really have to keep in mind the impacts of that on indigenous Black and brown people, because that is the impacts that we're facing today. And some of the ways in which I know myself, and I have seen in the survivors that I have served, is this prevalence of drug and alcohol as a way of coping with that disconnection from who we are, and disconnection from healthy ways of being. And also a lifetime of unspeakable oppressions, you know, and trauma. Those all impact us in really profound and at times devastating ways. I remember when I grew up primarily in my culture. I grew up in a military family, directly in a family that dedicated its life to public service. But I also grew up in primarily people of color communities, grew up in primarily indigenous communities, Filipino communities. And when I was coming back to communities that were predominantly white, that was complete culture shock for me. I didn't know how to navigate those communities. I'd come from communities where if you're having an issue, you know, you can walk around on any given day and find an auntie grill and a pork chop who is willing to give you at least a lunch worth of wisdom, whether you wanted it or not. You know, and that's how I learned to navigate my life in communities that are unlike mine, and unlike don't have that same access to handling life's battles and struggles. Actually, communities that sought to oppress me, whether I was cognizant of that or not. You know, I just think about all the issues we're facing today in the era of George Floyd. You know, that those systems that I was navigating weren't ever set up for me to be successful in the same ways that systems around culture are set up to be successful.
I think it's really important that as we're talking about trafficking, that we really talk about risk factors. And why are Indigenous people at a heightened risk? This has taken off a socioeconomic or I forgot what it is. I'm so sorry. Anyway, so Indigenous trafficking risk factors. When we're looking at these, we look at individual risk factors, relationship risk factors, community risk factors, and societal risk factors. And when we really look at Indigenous communities, we need to add a fifth one. And the fifth one would be historical trauma. And, you know, when we look at individual, it could be prior system involvement, you know, loss of identity. Our LGBTQ2IA+ and Two-Spirit individuals are at a heightened risk. Also, individuals that are immigrants and those that are undocumented find themselves in exploitation, not only here in the United States, but all over the world. And we cannot exclude boys and men. We can't. And, you know, really, traffickers target individuals that don't have adequate support systems. And if dysfunction in the home, it could be lack of economic opportunities, lack of training around trafficking. When we look at societal, we have to look at demand. And we also have to look at systemic racism and oppression. And when we look at historical, we have to look at destructive federal policies, and an overall lack of trust in the systems. And when we really look at the root causes of vulnerability and work to change and create systems to effectively combat human trafficking and supporting survivors, that's what we need to do. And that's why I'm so excited to be a part of the Human Collaborative.
That, Jerry, these issues to me look like they might overlap some. Would it be fair to say that these issues are intersectional?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is not an all-inclusive list. And one of the things that I do want to add on this is trafficking is big business. This is business to people. Globally, it is a $150.2 billion a year criminal enterprise.
Say it again. How much?
$150.2 billion criminal enterprise globally.
So that makes me think, when I see these heightened risk factors, and then you bring up money, and we think about the kind of policy decisions that city council and other decision makers are thinking of right now. How do you think that full decriminalization would help or lessen these risk factors? And do you think that full decriminalization has a vested interest in that $150.2 billion figure?
Don't get me started, Eric. I know we have a time limit, but you know, I would love to be invited back at some other time to just really take a deep dive into that.
Okay.
And so my answer to that, and you can feel my excitement, is 100%. If it wasn't big business, this wouldn't be happening. And when you really look at full decriminalization as opposed to the equality model, it is not about protecting the individual that's involved in prostitution. It's not. It's about decriminalizing buyers. And when we think about buyers, it's not that picture that people try to paint of a disabled guy, and you know, it is people that have shown up to some of the stings right here in Washington State as buyers with date rape drugs, with zip ties, with shovels, with handguns and all of the other things. So when we're looking at protecting buyers, we are asking for more violence. And the $150.2 billion, when we look at countries like Germany that have fully decriminalized, they are ran by syndicates, criminal enterprises, and the people that are filling these brothels, which by the way, some of them are 6 stories high and have panic buttons in each room. The people that are filling them are society's most vulnerable, which is no different than the people we are talking about when we're talking about domestic trafficking and indigenous people. And I want to point out too that these risk factors are not just indigenous risk factors. These could go across anybody and everybody. You know, so we have to look at the root causes and we have to change those and truly support people so we are not feeding a pipeline to exploitation.
Thank you. Now, we want to talk a little bit about the prevalence that we see for Native Americans in sexual violence and exploitation. According to the NIJ 2016 report, 56% of Native women have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. You know, we overlay this with the Urban Indian Health Institute's report that shows that Seattle, Washington, our city, is #1 in the nation for murdered and missing Indigenous women cases, with an undeniable link to human trafficking. We really have an issue right here in our front door. When we look at the access to victim services, 38% of that 58% were unable to receive any type of victim services. You overlay that with human trafficking and you're working with a marginalized population within a marginalized population within a marginalized population. So important to highlight how the equality model emphasizes access to services. Mm-hmm. And full decriminalization is nothing more than a market deregulation around a problem we don't have. Arizona State University did a study around how many buyers were actually looking to buy sex in Seattle, Washington within one 24-hour period. It's over 6,000 buyers. There's no other market I can think of in Seattle that has 6,000 buyers ready within one 24-hour period for a commodity, let alone a commodity that is a person.
You know, and like Eric just said, there's a link between murdered and missing Indigenous people and human trafficking. And sadly, a lot of times when law enforcement gets these cases and the family reveals that they're involved in the commercial sex trade, the priority of investigating the case goes down. And so we support decriminalizing the person that is in prostitution and fully going after traffickers and buyers, because we deserve options and we do not want to have a legacy of exploitation. You know, and I could go through many of these cases and I could have slides after slides after slides of Indigenous missing people. And, you know, like we said, many of them are linked to the sex trade. And Seattle's #1. And we need to stop this. We do. And full decriminalization is only going to fuel this.
We really need to be listening to more Indigenous peoples and to the different organizations that serve Native American Indigenous peoples in the Seattle area.
Yes, you know, not only listening, but also funders need to be supporting this. I know the MMIP work that we do is not supported financially, and so we do this because we have a passion and we know the link between MMIP and human trafficking.
We definitely support the equality model. It's a model that the City of Southern Human Rights Commission has signed on to. It's a model that King County has signed on to. And we've seen incredible improvements. And we have a lot further to go. It's not perfect in implementation right now. But as someone with lived experience in this, the equality model is the only thing that would have helped me in retrospect. Nothing about the men who have hurt me getting a free pass would have actually helped me.
Never. And, you know, as somebody with lived experience, you know, honestly, as an Indigenous woman, I have seen the effects of colonization and destructive, biased laws and interactions. And decriminalizing prostitution is colonialism on steroids. It really is.
I think I really want to clear up some things too that are out there in the public area or periphery around commercial sex exploitation, the sex trades, and how the terms people are using. Traffickers are not managers. It's not some friend that's helping you out, maybe in the very rarity of cases, but traffickers are overwhelmingly exploiters who use force, fraud, and coercion, and oftentimes a combination of all three to exploit the vulnerabilities of human trafficking survivors.
And it's very important that you understand that, yes, we could set policies that might make it physically safer, possibly, like red light districts, but you know, those haven't been successful in other countries. But there's absolutely no way you can regulate emotional harm. And this is a lifetime of emotional harm. And you have to realize that trafficking victims have a higher rate of PTSD than returning combat veterans.
And not even a fraction of the support.
No.
And you just cannot regulate that emotional harm.
And nobody talks about that. You know, because you could set up all of the you know, ideas that full decriminalization has, but when you talk about the emotional harm, nobody has an answer. And the answer is we deserve options and we deserve support. And my daughter, my sisters, my brothers, everybody deserves better than that. You know, honestly, finding my way home, I was trafficked from 13 till 19, and my journey in healing has been a lifetime. And I am incredibly honored to have people in my life, elders that speak wisdom to me, friends, youth, staff. I mean, I've learned just as much from my staff and, you know, my sisters and brothers and our allies, you know, that you can't even believe it. If we have a shared platform with shared leadership and true collaboration, we can do anything. We can.
And we deserve reflections of ourselves, true reflections of ourselves, not this false narrative of empowerment. You know, similar to the beginning stages of the domestic violence movement, we lack the language to conceptualize the harms done against us.
Yes.
Very similar. We cannot let history repeat itself with trafficking too.
I love this slide. You know, because you can't change the past, but you can definitely learn from it. And everything that's happened in my past, people have often asked me, oh, if you could change things, would you? Of course, nobody wants hurt and harm and trauma, but I can't. So I think it's very important that we take all of those challenges and look at it that this has molded us into who we are today.
It's a holistic process. We look at the recommendations that we want to give. It's to support the equality model, hold buyers accountable. Liberation comes from awareness, accountability, and autonomy. That is where liberation comes from. Without accountability, there's no liberation. To build opportunities for survivors to earn sustainable income, to give off-ramps out of exploitation, to real choice and autonomy, and develop policies and procedures and for official response protocols. People don't know when you're trying to leave that life that there is total systems failure.
Yes.
People don't know how to handle a trafficking case. And we need to be able to have set guidelines for what needs to happen, at least as a community and a municipality.
Yes.
To know what local services to refer victims to, and if there's not a local service, to advocate for the establishment of one, and to help find resources for both traditional and Western to help survivors access ways of healing. And just want to give thanks to everyone for listening to our presentation today. If you have any additional questions, you can email tasha@innovationshtc.org. Also email me or Jerry, Eric, ERIK@innovationshtc.org.
Or Jerry, JERI@innovationshtc.org. Tasha Elliott serves as our resource navigator. And if you have a victim or somebody that is seeking safety, that has had a history in the commercial sex industry, give us a call. We are here to support you because I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that survivors supporting survivors and peer-to-peer mentoring is an effective model. And I also want to add that our allies are important. And it doesn't matter what race you are or anything, you know, we all need to come together to end exploitation and to combat full decriminalization. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, are we going to move on to our next presenter? Kira, are you ready?
I'm all ready.
Fantastic. I'm just pulling up your presentation now.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, so I wanted to call this Coming to Believe just because my journey has really been an ongoing one. Navigating healing is something that is never easy. So my name is Kira Dobek. As Eric mentioned when he introduced me, and as I mentioned when I introduced myself, I am a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation. I grew up in Washington State, actually. I spent a few years up in Alaska when I was very young, and I spent time down in Oregon when I was in middle and high school. And I tell you this because when we're talking about just navigating the systems of instability that survivors face, I think that it's important to note that I moved over 20 times by the time that I was 18 years old. And so that's less than a year in each location as I was growing up. I'm a second generation survivor of commercial sexual exploitation. My mom was also exploited. Abuse and domestic violence were normal things in my home. And my story is not any different than the stories that I've heard as a direct service provider, as a survivor seeking support, and now as a person in leadership in this movement. Whenever I hear people talking about fully decriminalizing prostitution, this is something that really sits with me. And this quote by Herbert Spencer says, "There is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all arguments, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation." And part of my contempt prior to investigation, when I exited the life on December 10th, 2012, because I had a law enforcement interaction that was not related directly to my exploitation, but was peripherally attached to it, because I also have substance use disorder and I've been in recovery for almost over 7 years at this point. I thought that legalizing and regulating commercial sexual exploitation was the answer. I thought that it would make it safer. I thought that it would keep people from being trafficked. I thought that it would end harm. I thought that it would allow for people to not only have like regulations around safety, condoms, STD testing, all of these things. And it's because I hadn't done any research. And so when I went to my very first really educational experience around commercial sexual exploitation provided by the Organization for Prostitution Survivors, I remember very clearly leaning over to another survivor and saying, "But wouldn't completely legalizing this make it better?" And this person looked at me with absolute horror and said, "No, it would not." And I'm going to hopefully share some of the reasons why legalizing prostitution or full decriminalization of prostitution, meaning decriminalizing the person in prostitution, decriminalizing the sex buyer, and decriminalizing the manager, pimp, whatever they're calling themselves, third-party exploiter, whatever, is not the answer. So when I say I'm an ACE, for those of you who don't know what Adverse Childhood Experience Score, ACEs, is, ACEs really talks about this experience of traumatic events between the ages of birth and 17 years old. And the ACEs questionnaire or quiz goes through a series of questions. And these questions are involved with domestic violence, substance use disorder in the home, by a parent or a caregiver, abuse and neglect, so access to food, access to shelter, whether or not your family member has been incarcerated. It covers a whole lot of topics. And the score is, you know, goes up to 10, and I'm a 9 out of 10. And so when I think about my vulnerabilities, just due to the fact that I've experienced trauma, it is undeniable that I was a prime target for somebody to exploit me. And when I think about like what that 9 out of 10 score looks like for me, and I'm gonna run through this really quickly. I experienced physical abuse as a child. I experienced domestic violence in my home a ton as a child. A ton as a child. I was the one who had to call 911 when my mom and my stepdad got into it. I moved a ton, as I already mentioned. Substance use disorder was very prominent within my home. And I experienced incest, childhood sexual abuse, poverty. When I talk about poverty, like I'm talking canned chicken from the food bank, poor, trailer park, poor. And it was really, really challenging to try and come out of this. I always like to share this prostitution fact sheet with people, and I'm going to go through it, and I'm going to share with you that not only are these things really prevalent for me, but they are prevalent within my community. And so when we talk about who experiences exploitation, we talk about that average age of entering prostitution, and this is all from a study done by Melissa Farley, who is one of the leading researchers on commercial sexual exploitation. You can go and read her studies at prostitutionresearch.com. If you have not read the research, I encourage you to read the research, because the research does not lie. I was 14 the first time that I was approached for exploitation. I had run away from home because it was abusive. There was substance use going on at home. I did not feel safe. I grew up in a home where it was normal. When I said, I'm hungry, I was told, no, you're not. When I said, I needed to use the bathroom, I was told, no, you don't. And so when we talk about just some of the things that happen for people, I am used to my body not being mine. I'm used to not listening to my body. In fact, even today, you know, and I'm almost 8 years out of the life. It'll be 8 years on December 10th. And I still have a hard time recognizing when I'm thirsty, when I need to use the bathroom, and when I'm hungry, because I've been disassociated from my body since I was 4 years old. That is normal for me. When we talk about like who reports a history of incest or sexual abuse as a child, I have heard, and I've served hundreds of clients, and I've talked with hundreds of survivors from all over the world, and hearing this common story is just very much like my story. I mean, it's so common for me to hear I was raped by an uncle, my father, my stepdad, my brother, a cousin when I was a baby. That is just as common in my mind for somebody to say, like, I've made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in my lifetime. And so for me, I'm like, oh yeah, that's pretty normal, right? The history of incest, like I said, 70% of people who are exploited reported that they experienced incest. Porn was something that was used to educate me by my exploiter. And we find that pimps normalize, or exploiters or managers, whatever they want to call themselves, normalize abuse through pornography. Because pornography, as most of us know at this point, has gotten increasingly violent, and it is normalized. Like, that violence is normalized. That's where, unfortunately, most people are going for sexual education, which is incredibly problematic, especially when you look at the fact that people do not have, it is not shown that people need to have like mutuality and consent and relationship in that sense, right? 90% report having a pimp. 85% report being raped by their pimp. And I've had several pimps. I engaged in survival-based sex, in prostitution, where you receive money for a sex act. I've been groomed online by men starting at 12 years old, when America Online started, really to step onto the stage as a possibility or platform for grooming kids for exploitation and abuse. When that rape number comes up, like, I have been raped so many times, I couldn't even tell you how many it's been. It happened daily, multiple times daily, for over 5 years, not including the people who purchased me for sex, which is essentially paid rape. We always don't, like, something that you don't hear talked about is men and trans folks in this issue. There's not a lot of studies, but Melissa Farley did talk with folks from many different gender identities and backgrounds. And what we're finding in 5 countries, South Africa, Thailand, Turkey, USA, and Zambia, 62% have been raped in prostitution by a buyer. 73% physically assaulted. 72% are currently or formerly homeless. I was homeless off and on between the ages of 18 all the way up until 26 when I finally got out of the life. When we talk about who is in prostitution and wants out, immediately 92% of those surveyed. So 475 people in prostitution, 92% want out now. Mortality rate. We have a high mortality rate, and this is in connection directly to what Jerry and Eric were talking about. We have high instances and propensity for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. 75% of us have attempted suicide. I am somebody who has had many instances where I was convinced that dying would be the best solution. 15% have completed suicide or died by suicide. Another study out of Colorado Springs talks about this, and it was a 33-year study that studied almost 2,000 women that were in or are in commercial sexual exploitation experiences. And the average age of death is 34 years old, a year older than I am. And most of the time, the cause of death is homicide at the hands of buyers. So when we talk about prostitution or sex work, it is harmful, absolutely harmful. So when we're talking about what the Nordic model means for survivors, we need to decriminalize the person who is being prostituted, exploited, or engaging in sex work. Most of us, I haven't met anybody who hasn't experienced all or most of these: childhood abuse, childhood sexual trauma, or incest, poverty, violence, domestic violence, rape. Buyers and pimps really capitalize on our vulnerabilities and commodify the abuse and normalize it. When you're used to being molested or raped or having to trade sex for a safe place to sleep, like I did, it becomes normal that I am like a human credit card or a human cash machine, right? It's normal, and it should not be normal. Comprehensive and holistic services for people who have experienced complex trauma. We need specialized support for safe housing, legal services, substance use disorder, mental health support, education, professional training, and long-term emotional support. We need communities where we can connect, heal, grow, and like fly. And Eric and Jerry have talked about this need for culturally appropriate services. And that's absolutely true. I've served, like I said, predominantly folks of color. I've served lots of Native American folks. I've served trans folks. And what I can tell you is that all of the violence that I've told you about, and I used to get my butt beat by my pimp. Beat. That everything that I experienced was still a lesser violence than people who have more intersections of race or gender or socioeconomic class than I have. And my life has been incredibly violent. I'm talking like torture, physical and mental and sexual. And so when we're talking about like those safe and holistic supports, what they look like. I needed a place where I could talk about it. I went to treatment for substance use disorder, and I'm so grateful to be clean. But I'll tell you what, nobody ever screamed me for being exploited. Nobody at the jails that I went through screamed me for being exploited. Nobody helped me. I talked with teachers and nurses and school staff and friends' parents and my own family, and nobody helped me. So we need to have holistic services, and that is what the Nordic model, also called the equality model, really talks about, is decriminalize people who are prostituted, give them services and off-ramps, give them holistic services. Services can do a lot of things. I had a section chapter. I received a whole bunch of support, and if I hadn't, like, support groups, yoga, getting in touch with my body, like all of it, if I hadn't had those spaces, I would have never ever believed that I had the ability to pay my bills, because my parents told me I'm nothing without him. I can do anything without him. My parents told me that I have no chance of ever figuring it out. When I got out of the life, I never had a bill in my name. My credit score was the 280, and yes, it can go low. I've never had my name on an apartment lease. I never rented a place for myself.
Kira, excuse me. Your sound was cutting in and out, and I'm just wondering if we can maybe we can adjust the video, turn off the video, and maybe try with just the sound, or if there's another way we can clarify the sound.
Okay, how's the sound now?
It's clear.
Okay, wonderful. Sometimes it does that. Thank you for the heads up. What I was saying is that really there's no limit to what I can do now. And I've moved into roles that, like, if you had asked me everything I wanted when I exited the life, I would have never told you anything that I've done since I've gotten out. I've served on a couple of boards since I've gotten out of the life. I've moved into leadership positions. I've served survivors. I've worked alongside police, and I hated police when I got out of the life. And I was very fortunate to work with some people that were specialized and trained in this issue. I've gotten my own home. I live in a quiet neighborhood. I'm in a relationship that is built on the foundations of trust, respect, and mutuality, but I still struggle, and I still struggle to get out of bed, and I still struggle with triggers and trauma and all the things that happened with me in the life, and I still struggle to know who I am and where I stand sometimes. When we're talking about the Nordic model, what it means for pimps and exploiters. So sex buying is a criminal offense. Buyers don't care if you have a pimp or a manager or a marketing guy. They never ask. And really, the truth is that most of them can't wait to go and review people like me, like a dishwasher, on their little sex buying websites that have sometimes up to 20,000 buyers. I have literally been reviewed like an appliance. And that's all they saw me as an appliance. And it was violent, and it was violating. And I had pimp slip condoms and all kinds of, and I had buyer slip condoms. And nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about when you're in a room with a guy that's twice as big as you, how you can say, no, I'm not really interested in that. Like, I've been sodomized and all kinds of shit. Like, the truth is that unless you've experienced it and you've had some time to step away from the trauma, when you're still sitting in your trauma, it's really hard to speak about what kind of violence you've experienced. It means that pimping and sex trafficking is criminalized. These are abuses of human rights. And truthfully, like, my pimps talked about how they were going to protect me and how they were going to never leave me alone and how we were going to get all this and how they were going to make sure that I never had to worry about anything ever again. And it capitalized on my experience of lifetime abuse. Really, the human rights approach is address the roots of exploitation: poverty, racism, transphobia, homophobia, misogyny, and more. We need to have prevention programming in schools. We need to educate upcoming generations on the societal problem of buying sex and exploiting others. We need to have training for police and for people who provide services to providers, medical personnel, counselors, substance use disorder, legal advocates, the whole gamut. That's how we stop the cycle of abuse and misplaced blame, lack of services, and inadequate care for survivors. And I've received a lot of inadequate care over the years because people didn't understand. And lastly, we need laws that protect people who are targeted for exploitation, not the people who monetize and commodify the abuse of other people. And so really, again, we need to educate people. We need to have policies that support it. We need to have public awareness. We need to prevent it from happening. We need to provide services to survivors, holistic wraparound services. And we need to decriminalize them and criminalize people who are doing the abuse. We need to not legalize commercialized rape. Thank you.
Thank you, Kira. Thank you so much for that rich presentation, and we really appreciate everything you shared and the time it's taken to prep for the presentation. Just really appreciate you. Thank you. Francesca, are you available to share for your presentation?
Thank you.
This is Francesca. She is a collaborative partner with the Human Collaborative. We're really thankful for her participation with the group and everything that she shared with us. I'm really honored to present. Francesca's our next presenter. It's also 2018 Trafficking in Persons Hero Award. And here's Francesca.
Eric, thank you for introducing me. So the first slide is a video, and the video tend to answer my questions on what the government needs to do to make sure that they are taking into account the needs of survivors. So the video Eric is going to present will give an insight of the answer to the question. Thank you. Hello. What the government needs to do to make sure they are taking into account the needs of survivors. First and foremost, you can't come in to solve a problem without meeting with those who are affected by the problem. So the government need to get on a table with survivors. If they cannot get to survivors, actually like a crowd, they can at least select survivors leaders to be on the same table with them for they to hear their plight and to see how they can help them. So this is what I think needs to be done first before they go need. Actually, survivors are those who have gone through thin and turns and they have returned back home safely in one piece. They need a life. They need something to get themselves busy so that they can be resilient in their various communities they have settled in. So the government on its own part need to provide them with those services that they need. Maybe as survivors, the government can give them some free medical training, free medical attention, free psychosocial support, and most importantly, provide them with activities to be economically sustainable. For example, the government should open his vocational training centers for survivors to be trained there free. And with the knowledge they will gain from that centers, I think they will be ready to assimilate, to reintegrate into the various community and move on with their lives smoothly. And once again, they will not remember the tragedy they have been through. And life for them will be a turn of leaf. And
Right. Thank you so much for that response, Francesca. And we have your findings available here, and then we have the other questions as well.
Yeah, question two says that what are the most important things that survivors need for support and protection once they have been rescued? We all in this panel are survivors. We already know what survivors need, but I'm speaking from an African perspective, what survivors really need. Actually, what survivors need to protect themselves, what they need to get themselves back into their communities. I know most importantly, we always stipulate, coming from an African perspective, on empowerment, getting them doing something to sustain their livelihood. But as I've gone in depth into my fight against human trafficking and protecting survivors, I've realized that economic empowerment comes after certain things have been put in place. And I'm trying to make sure that my community sees that first, because when you come back from your ordeal, when you're rescued nationally, domestically, or internationally, you need to regain your sanity. And coming from my background, my community, if you are not really strong enough, your own immediate family stands against you for coming back because they see you as a failure. So what I have used my own story to empower people or to train them or to make a change is to make them know that when you come back, you need to be strong for yourself because you are, as a person, you're very important. You need to try to go and take some psychosocial, medically check up yourself because as per my own story, as per my own recovery, when I came back, I was really psychologically down. So I had to go and seek the attention of a psychiatrist, which really helped me a lot to bounce back to life in full health as a person. So what our organization tries to do is to make them see the psychosocial support of bringing them together, gaining their sanity, standing firm as a full person once again, and most importantly, to see life positively and forget about stigmatization that the community and their immediate family pause on them. Because as I'm speaking, even till now, 5 years out of my journey, 5 years into my journey of recovery, I am still being stigmatized by my own immediate family. So I think survivors need support to get themselves back, and so as well as economic empowerment or getting them resilient in their communities. So I think these are what survivors need to support them to stand back and bounce back to life. Thank you. The key barriers that survivors have as challenges to participate in policy making or lawmaking that concerns them. I'm speaking from an African background. I think survivors are most often being set aside. They are being looked upon as low-class citizens, or most often as survivors are being qualified as people who are not educated. They don't have any say in what laws that are being put in place to affect them. So I think the government needs to do something to make sure survivors take part in policy making or law making that concerns them. So I think those are the key barriers survivors face, them being stigmatized or being looked as low-class citizens to be part of policy making concerning them is not a good thing. So what I urge, and in the video I made, I stipulated clearly that things need to be done justly, because I will set aside a challenge that I've been facing for years with my government. Most often I'm called every year on a yearly basis by my government to come and make some laws or to place to them what has been happening as a survivor and as a survival leader. We go there, we sit on the table, we talk, survivors, leaders, and other civil society organizations leading human trafficking activities. We talk, we give them a plight, we give them the report of what we've been doing. We are on the grounds, we meet with survivors, we meet with the cases hand on hand, we give them back, but what they do, it ends on that table. Nothing is being done after that day. So it's really something that I don't know who can push our government, because we are trying on our own path to make sure that these citizens for things to change, the table need to be turned to see how our government tries to look at human trafficking as well as survivors who are those who have been affected. Though they are survived, but they are important and they have a say as well in policy making that governs them. I've jointly answered question 3 and question 4, as I think question 3, 4, and 5 have some connection, because I just heard about being called every year by the government to partake or to give reports to what we've been doing in the ground on the grounds. But we go there, we do do our best to tell them or to report to them the activities we've been doing and what survivors on grounds need. But all that happens is ends on that table on that same day and nothing is being done. They will always promise us that we'll be called and they'll get to us, but nothing ever happens. Even at the level of other ministries, like the ministry in charge of women, nothing ever happened aside meeting them one-on-one, telling them everything that is needed, telling them the plight of survivors, but it's really difficult. But that should not put us survivors down or should not make us to stop what we are doing. We keep on doing what we are doing because we are best at doing what we are doing. And we know that what we are doing without the government, though he is the upper hand, but we are making great changes and we can't relent our effort.
Thank you, Francesca. Is there anything else you would like to share outside of the questions and the slides?
Yes, I would like to share a little bit about how human trafficking is being looked upon in my country, Cameroon, and Africa at large. Though we young survivors bringing it on the table are trying to turn a leaf, but the old things are still existing. Human trafficking in Africa and Cameroon particularly is seen as some sort of prestige to the family where the family of the victim. Most often when we started what we're doing back then in 2015, we had a lot of difficulties with people in our community, going to them, telling them that this happened to us. I was trafficked to Kuwait. I was being deceived to go and serve as an English language teacher, but on arriving in Kuwait, I was being forced into domestic servitude where I endured sexual abuses, and I almost sold my kidney to free myself. They will always laugh at me. They laugh at me not because my story is funny, they laugh at me because they see me as lazy, or the team of survivors that we started the initiative together. They saw us as failures, like, oh, you girls are lazy. Traveling abroad is like making you some of money. People in a communities, they believe that there's money hung on trees out there. And most often they don't even know that they need to think or they need to double check where their children are going to, the type of jobs they are going to do there, and the salary that they have been promised, as well as what the people employing them in the other side have spent on them. They just believe that getting to an aircraft or going to live in a village to a big city within the same country is some sort of prestige. It's like the family is having somebody out there, so they are on a different level, like a higher level in that community. So it's really something, human trafficking is seen very differently in Africa. That's something we, young leaders, group of young leaders on the forefront fighting against this human wrong are trying to change the narratives of an African dimension of what human trafficking is. Because in Africa, in Cameroon specifically, it's still hard for some people to take that word as something negative. So I just want to throw more light and try to make people in the US, people joining us in Seattle, in Washington State, to see that this is how the thing is in our own community. But we are working hard to make sure that they come to reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. We are really lucky to have you, and just really want to give you thanks for everything you shared with us, and just really appreciative of your being part of the collaborative. Thank you. We do have some time. Oh, sorry. We do have some time for some questions. If there's any questions from the participants for any of the presenters, we have a couple of minutes to step those. And you can put that in the chat. We'll just give you a couple minutes to present those if you'd like. And while we're waiting for some questions, I do have a question for some of our panelists. How do you think, when you hear that people are viewing buyers and traffickers as more like a victimless crime, as somebody that we should decriminalize and protect, what do you think the impact is going to be on particularly those most impacted by the commercial sex trade and human trafficking? You're included, so you can answer.
That's a really good question. When we look at society's most vulnerable, and oftentimes multi-generational, and exploitation is often, yeah, exploitation is often generational. How do we break that? I can tell you that by decriminalizing buyers and traffickers, that is not going to break any of those generational impacts. And we need options. We do. We need opportunities. If there's employers that are out there that are listening, you know, we need to have options. How can you help somebody, you know, leave a life of exploitation when you're not able to sustain yourself in a way that you can support yourself or your children? And so we really need to build opportunities. And it doesn't matter if it's in Cameroon or if it's here in the United States, we all need to have options. And I really, you know, appreciate everything that everybody has said today. And there's no way that decriminalizing buyers and managers, traffickers, is going to make it better.
A question from the audience. Why do trafficking survivors, run so often? This is coming from a social worker, and just expressing that when there's a safe placement from the state, there's often a report of them running away or refusing to accept the safe placement. And specifically, what are some of the reasons why survivors might run away or refuse that placement? And what can Jill do, that person do to gain their trust and build their trust? Kira or Francesca? Or both?
I'm gonna hop in here really quick. My experience with working with youth in the foster care system, we can't really denounce the value of one survivor helping and mentoring another survivor. There's something magical that happens within that relationship. It's really hard as a social worker or an advocate to be able to show up whenever these kids reappear. Right? I had youth that were in foster care for years and years and years that experienced exploitation and all of these things. When it's normal for you to be on the streets and you've got a family on the streets that is down for you no matter what, and then you go into these placements and you blow out of them real quick, the structure of placements is not conducive to the healing of survivors, because we're used to making decisions. Like, so many of my clients would say things like, I'm not allowed to smoke, and I smoke cigarettes and stuff like that. And so the prioritization of the services is, and the stipulations that placements have on survivors is incredibly unhelpful. In fact, it drives us back to the streets when there's too many judgments or too many expectations put on us. And so the relationship is the most important thing. Showing up when you say you're going to show up, doing what you say you're going to do. If they hit you up and they say, I'm hungry, I need clothes, I need to go to the doctors, whatever it looks like, that's how you build the relationship. You suit up and you show up when you say you will. And one thing that I've found is really helpful is, like, when my kids would blow out of placement and they'd be on the run for months, I'd have contact with them either on their Facebook or their phone, but most of the time it's a Wi-Fi phone. But I would just message them and be like, I'm thinking about you. Let me know if you need anything. I'm here if you need anything. And that's it. No expectations on the relationship, because the expectations are things that create, like, this dynamic that's unhelpful between youth that are currently in foster care and youth that are, like, and social workers. So when they're on the run, they don't trust anybody. They're scared that they're going to be taken to juvie, because that's typically what happens, is status offense stuff. And it's not helpful. In fact, it's further traumatization stacked upon already a lot of trauma. So I don't know if that's necessarily helpful, but remember always, the relationship is the most important thing.
Absolutely, and if I can briefly add to that, Kira, that's okay. Thank you. From the boys and men side and LGBTQ side of that, there's not systems set up to serve. And without those systems set up to serve, what are we going to refer people to? It's a fraction of what they need or deserve, right? Like, I really fully believe, particularly our children, youth, and all survivors of exploitation deserve access to autonomy and self-affirming lives. You know, how many times I've taken a client in for services, the closest thing we can find is DV services, and the representative telling the survivor that they are the perpetrator of the crime. And it's just total systems failure. So we have to really be mindful. And I think one way we can gain trust, to respond with a question, is that to understand and to exhibit that understanding of what you're asking that person to go through, down to, like, this is what's going to happen when you arrive. You're going to have to check your bag. You're going to have to bring only this amount. Like, what is their experience of it? This is the bus you're going to ride. This is the, down to the T, what is your experience of it? And I think that really shows compassion, understanding, and some degree of empathy as well.
Excellent.
Francesca, I think you were saying something.
Yeah, I wanted to chip into the question, why do trafficked victims run so often? Actually, Eric, to the based on what we've been communicating, I don't think we have a safe placement home here that I've known, to the best of my knowledge. But despite the fact that we don't have, I use my home as a temporary safe home. And when you try to get a survival sister in, they always, like, they are not confident. They feel like they are not wanting, you give them all the love, but in less than 1, 2, 3 days, some might stay for like 1 to 3 weeks, and they now get a relative they can go and squat with. But some that you're willing for them to stay long, they just get up and decide that they are leaving. So I don't know if maybe seeing what I'm doing, some of them feel the unbalance that I've become a different person. I'm no longer the survivor. It's like that disparity for them to really be close to me. And some of them see me as, when you go close to Francisca, you stand a chance to share your story. And some of them are so reserved that they die inwardly. They are dying because they are so shy to share what they have experienced. And they know that maybe Francisca will urge me to say it out. So it's really somehow difficult to really bring them close to you and to gain that trust. I don't know why. We all have been through the same ordeal. We all are fine, we are rescued, but I don't know, this gap is still there, but I'm struggling my own little way to bridge that gap.
Thank you, Francesca. It's very powerful.
I wanted to add something really quickly, and I want to be mindful of time, so this is going to be real quick. You have to understand trauma bonding, and you have to understand the impact of trauma itself. And when you look statistically, and I've been doing this work for over 20 years, I would say 90% of the individuals that I worked with had a trauma background that had never been addressed. And you know, often self-medicate, and there's a lot of different things in there, but traffickers are famous within the recruitment and the grooming and the breaking process to remove all other source of need fulfillment. So they become 100% dependent on them. And this is a very strong bond. And we would love to be invited back for all of us on the panel to just dig deeper into that. But we have one more question, and it's a really good question. So I'm going to leave it at that, and thank you.
One more question, briefly going over for a minute, understand that people have to leave. The question that we have is, how do gentlemen's clubs, strip clubs, influence this issue when a Portland, Oregon's claim to fame is having the most strip clubs per capita in the US?
So number one problem there is calling them gentlemen's clubs. I've never met a single gentleman in a strip club. So number two with that is, again, it normalizes the commodification of people's bodies, because like talked about throughout like this entire presentation, really, like, we're talking about people who are not building relationships and situations based upon mutuality, autonomy, and consent. And so the thing that happens within like a variety, like all of the sex trades really, is that consent is commodified. And so you are paying for the illusion of consent. So that's how it influences it, normalizes it. And, you know, prostitution is unfortunately something that tends to inherently happen within strip clubs.
That really speaks to me, Kira. You know, I think about when gay men first started to see themselves in media. It was in these adult bookstores in gay pornography, right? And that's when we started to see representation to some degree. And it was all inherent to the commercial sex industry. And so when we have, I think like when we talk about LGBTQIA+, inclusion and equity within response to commercial sex exploitation, we have to, again, keep in mind, just like with Indigenous people, the history behind where we've been and where we are now. These things overlay, these things get complicated, and that impact of having an integrated part of the commercial sex industry in your community is going to be felt.
Yeah. Really quickly, I wanted to add, do a Google search around strip clubs and trafficking. There's numerous reports that are out there, and I know, because, you know, I'm a survivor, I've worked in strip clubs before, a majority of the individuals in there have pimps and they have traffickers, and also pornography. You have to look at pornography. Often traffickers force their victims to film pornography so that they can hold it as a tool to blackmail. And also webcamming. You know, so it may, like Kira said, have the illusion of looking like there is consent. And even if they don't have a trafficker, there's always these power dynamics of the manager in the club. And to me, the manager in the club is a trafficker because you are paying them, but that is an entire different series. But inherently, strip clubs, pornography, webcamming, you know, any form of the commercial sex trade has a high percentage and direct link to trafficking.
I want to give thanks to all the panelists and to everyone who's attended today. If you have any last thoughts, now is a good time. If not, we thank you and we really look forward to continued collaboration. Bye, everyone.